Oh, come on, there it is. Yes, that's it. Scene three. Scene three. Check. All right, good. I think we're in good shape for the shape we're in.
Testing audio stream. Testing audio stream 1 2.
Yeah, I think that.
Like I don't recall much variation actually at all here. I thought it was interesting because they have different levels of facilities, but I take it that they're all not-for-profits and they just have the facilities and they don't have them.
Yeah. That's all in Cambridge or the whole Boston?
Well, two of my kids are in public school. One's in private school. Private school in Newton, where I am. Between Newton and Brookline right there, there's like 5 or 6 private schools. Just a density of them, which I find interesting as well, because where I grew up.
Wanted to get a sense of it. Yeah. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Michael Frank for today's seminar. And he's one of the pioneers in computational psychiatry, which is a new area of research that NIMH is emphasizing. The idea is to understand human diseases from computational perspectives so that we can get a more principled way of understanding and treating these patients. And so this is a big initiative, and he has been in the field, or he kind of generated that movement for a long time. And he majored electrical engineering in Queen's University, Canada, and he moved to University of Colorado studying electrical engineering for master's degree, but he switched to more cognitive science and combined human patient studies with cognitive experiments in patients. And he studied and published a number of influential papers. In 2004, he has a paper called By Carrot or By Stick. In this paper, very famous paper, he studied Parkinson's patients using reinforcement learning experiments and found peculiar biases in the way that human patients learn from a positive or negative reward. And he also studied deep brain stimulation effect in cognitive tasks like withholding, responding in complex situations, and so on. So he really pioneered this area of the field, and his style is using a model which incorporates some of the details of fundamental structures of the neural circuit, which he will describe today, and to try to explain various interesting behavioral and cognitive phenomena. So his current models incorporate reinforcement learning and also various cognitive functions, including working memory, and which is going to be the topic of today's talk. So.
Thank you very much. That was a very generous introduction. Oh, yeah, that is my... Okay. So the first few slides are essentially already given by now. But I will just try to illustrate in cartoon form sort of the big picture view of how we think computational modeling as a link between brain and mind can also be informative for trying to understand disorders of the mind and brain. And so this is just an illustration of one sort of pipeline of the sort of one way of doing computational psychiatry research. It's not the only way, and it's also not the only way that we do it. But you can start off with some kind of task design where you take tasks that are trying to measure behavioral phenotypes and ideally are motivated by particular neural circuits or understanding of how neural systems work. And then you could administer those tasks, sort of a battery of those tasks that get at these different kinds of mechanisms to, for example, clinical and non-clinical populations. And then hopefully you have some kind of mathematical model or computational model that describes the relationship between sort of latent parameters, and I'll give you some examples of that later on, that explain behavior and explain brain behavior relationships. In this case, I'm just showing you a schematic of a popular model called the drift diffusion model that we sometimes use, but I won't talk about that today. The idea is essentially that you're just specifying sort of what's going on inside the mind and how it might be implemented in the brain. But when you're doing that, you're trying to characterize the relationship between brain and mind and characterize behavior quantitatively. And in order to do that, you have to estimate parameters of those models for individual subjects. And there's various different ways of doing parameter estimation that could be more or less robust. And then the idea is to take the parameters from those models and do some kind of prediction. So you might want to, for example, classify based on somebody's parameters that describe their behavior or brain behavior relationships, and ask, do those predict whether the patient has, let's say, depression or not? Does it predict whether they're going to respond to a particular drug? Does it predict when they're going to develop Huntington's disease, when they're going to convert? Or you might want to do some kind of unsupervised clustering where you try to sort of diagnose ways in which these parameters cluster together without pre-specifying how it might relate to something like a DSM category. And applying that basic strategy, you can also try to quantify how useful is this strategy, how useful is a model in general. And one way you could do that is you could take the parameters of these models and try to predict, okay, just as an example, let's say we're going to predict whether someone has major depressive disorder or not. And you could build a machine learning classifier that essentially is combining these theoretical models, which are extracting the parameters, and more of a data-driven approach that says, well, which combination of them is related to disease? And you could ask, based on that model, if you then take the machine learning approach and apply it to new data, to new patients, how well is the classifier, how good is it at predicting whether the person really has that disorder or not, for example? And then to do that, you can just plot the standard sensitivity against specificity, or these ROC curves. And essentially, if you're on the unity line here, it would mean that you just are, the classifier is randomly being able to predict whether someone is in one condition or another. But if you're above the unity line, it means that you're more likely to get hits and less likely to get false alarms. And generally what we see, this is an illustration from a paper that I had with Quentin Huys. But this basic result we've seen in various empirical examples in these conditions over here, where if you use the raw data, which is what you're using to collect data from patients, it's behavioral data and brain imaging data, you can ask, how well do you do? And then you could say, well, if I give, instead of the raw data, I give parameters that are extracted from models that are trying to sort of summarize the key features, trying to sort of carve nature by its joints, so to speak, you can often do better in the sense that you are better at detecting when somebody is in one condition versus another. And the degree to which you improve that is in one way of sort of quantifying how useful a model is, even acknowledging that none of our models are actually correct, strictly speaking. Of course, the models of the brain and behavior are all simplifications, and there are various things that are wrong about them, but you can still ask how useful are they in sort of reducing the dimensionality of the problem to something that might correspond to mechanisms that are relevant for mental illness. Okay, so I'm going to try to illustrate one example of this approach, eventually applied to patients with schizophrenia, but it'll take a while before I get to the patient data. And to do that, I want to sort of start off by talking about some of the work that Now alluded to, and also relates to some of his own work and Sam Gershman's work and a bunch of other people's work here. And there's, as a lot of you are probably familiar with, there's a large body of work that suggests across species, from rodents and even other more primitive creatures all the way up to humans and monkeys and so forth, that if you look at dopamine neurons, they tend to, the activity in dopamine neurons correlates with reward prediction errors. That is, when events are better than expected or worse than expected. So not just whether you get a reward or not, but whether the reward is more than you expect. And so this is an example of if a human is performing some kind of financial decision-making task or making some choices, they might be winning or losing money. We could estimate, based on what they've learned so far, whether the amount of money they won is better or worse than expected. And if it's better, you would see an increase, and if it's worse than expected, you would see a decrease. And this is a sort of a variable that's extracted from a computational model that's fit to their learning behavior in this kind of financial decision-making task. And then you could ask if you sort of, you track where in the brain using functional imaging tends to track that parametric change in reward prediction error activity, you tend to see the striatum light up. And this is a result that's been seen across many studies. You can see it in meta-analyses and so forth. So it's a parametric contrast. It's also the case that this signal is modulated by dopamine drugs, so drugs that are given to people in Parkinson's disease patients and in other healthy populations. The level of that signal tends to be scaled, and the degree to which you see it is predictive of learning ability. And that was largely informed by some seminal work by Peter Dayan and Reid Montague on sort of linking models of reinforcement learning in computer science to what the dopamine system might be doing. And then one of the things that we are interested in is asking, what is the implications for that on downstream structures? So how do these prediction errors actually modulate learning and decision making in largely focusing on the basal ganglia? And this is the result that Now alluded to before, showing, and I'm not giving you anything about the actual design of the experiment, I'm just going to summarize the main result, which he actually already did, which is if you take patients with Parkinson's disease, and if they're not medicated, they have low levels of dopamine in the striatum, and then you give them a task that assesses how well do they learn from negative reward prediction error. So that is, how well do they avoid making some decisions that had led to a lot of costs in the past, a lot of losses of money. And they're pretty good, but they're not as good at learning to make decisions that had led to positive prediction errors. And importantly, the same patients, when they're medicated, so they have an increase of their dopamine levels, they show exactly the opposite bias. They learn more from positive prediction errors and less from negative prediction errors. And while that basic result was essentially predicted by the model about the role for dopamine in prediction errors in the basal ganglia, which I'll show in a minute, you can also think about how it might have some relevance for the real world. So for example, it's known that a subset of patients that are given these dopamine agonists become compulsive gamblers or compulsive shoppers and so forth. And you can imagine that just having an asymmetry in how much you learn from gains and losses can make you more likely to repeat actions that are like gambling decisions. Not that that's the only mechanism, but it does have some functional relevance. It's also the case that this pattern is, not only has it been replicated in Parkinson's patients in 15 different studies, but it's also been shown in healthy people who are given drugs that increase or decrease their dopamine levels using fMRI or not, and in various other populations as well. You could also see individual differences in young, healthy people without any dopamine manipulations at all. You just look at their genetics, and there are certain genes that correlate with dopamine function in the striatum. This is an example of one of them. That variance in that gene predicts the relative bias. So this is positive, means they look more like medicated Parkinson's patients. They learn more from positive than negative prediction errors. And this is the other way around. So before I guess I'll say that I'm going to show a cartoon of what we think is going on here. This is highly simplified in the sort of corticostriatal system. There are these two different pathways that we sometimes call go and no-go pathways, or direct and indirect pathways that have D1 and D2 receptors. And we think that these positive and negative prediction errors that are conveyed by the dopamine system are actually driving opponent learning processes, different plasticity mechanisms in these different pathways. And that these different systems are actually representing essentially the costs and the benefits of alternative actions. And then you have to sort of compare the costs and the benefits of all these actions in order to make a choice. And if you have Parkinson's disease, you have low levels of dopamine. And so this learning in this pathway is sort of overemphasized compared to that pathway. And that's what leads to this pattern of results. And so with other colleagues, we've tried to study this behavior in rodent models as well, where you can deplete dopamine levels in the striatum. And you can show that Parkinson-like behavior, so the inability to move in complex motor skill learning tasks, for example, does not result only from an effect of dopamine depletion on performance, which has been appreciated for a long time. If you don't have enough dopamine, it's harder to move. But actually, you can get progression of Parkinson-like symptoms through this kind of avoidance learning mechanism. So if a person or a rat has depleted dopamine in the striatum, they tend to sort of learn as if there's negative prediction errors, and they become more and more avoidant with time. And you can counteract that mechanism in various ways with certain drugs or receptor knockouts of this pathway. We've also seen that even though that was what I was just alluding to was rat studies, you can also look at the relevance of this sort of abstracted task, which is a cognitive neuroscience task that we gave to patients, and ask how relevant is it for the real world of humans. And I guess I'll just say two quick things about that before moving on. So one is that if you image people while they're doing this task and you measure dopamine release using PET, the amount of dopamine release you see in the striatum is during the task is not only predictive of how many points, how well they do in the task, but it's also predictive of whether they're likely to repeat an action that they enjoyed in their real world, right? So if someone goes out and tries squash and you ask them, did you enjoy squash? They'll say yes, 7 or whatever. Then you ask, does that enjoyment rating actually relate to how likely they are to play squash again sometime in the future? And that relationship between enjoyment and repeating behavior is related to the degree to which you see dopamine release in this task and their performance in this task. Also, conversely, I have a graduate student that I'm co-mentoring in public health who has some interesting new data where she's looking at exercise regimes in people who are inactive and somewhat obese. And she's trying to get them to perform more exercise and to sort of measure on a day-to-day basis how much they're enjoying the exercise and how much it felt aversive and so forth. And what she's seeing is that performance in this task, before they do anything, the degree to which they learn more to avoid negative outcomes than positive outcomes is predictive of the degree to which they stop exercising, because it sort of feels like it's more and more costly across weeks. So all of that was just to emphasize that sometimes we do these contrived laboratory tasks in order to get at some mechanisms and try to relate them to animals and so forth, but it's not always obvious how it relates to the real world. And I think this is an example where it might relate to the real world. We also tried, this is another cartoon of the underlying circuitry, but it's a little bit less cartoonized than the last diagram. This is a neural network model that we've developed over the last couple of decades that simulates the neurons and the dynamics involved in these systems, where we can use the same model to predict patterns of behavior like this and various other patterns of behavior, but we could also use it to try to make predictions about patterns of electrophysiology in different parts of the circuit. But I'm not going to go into any detail on that now. Only to say that the model has also been used to confirm, or I shouldn't say confirm because science is always open, but to validate some of the predictions of this model in mouse models where you can record selectively from D2 neurons as the mice are engaged in a task that involves winning and losing, so they get positive and negative prediction errors. And what this study showed in Nature was that activity in the D2 neurons of the striatum goes up when animals get an outcome that's worse than expected. And the degree to which that happened was related to the degree to which they avoided selecting risky choices on the next trial. And optogenetically, you can also activate those neurons and show that it doesn't just stop behavior altogether, which is what the sort of classical models of the direct-indirect pathway would say, but instead it causes risk-avoidant behavior. It causes an animal to choose a safe option and avoid a risky option. So there's sort of nice translational value in relating this paradigm. However, all of that sort of sales pitch has a lot of buts. So one of the buts is that not only in humans, also in other animals, learning involves multiple cognitive components, not just sort of this incremental reinforcement learning process from positive and negative prediction errors. And these components interact with each other, even though a lot of times people like to separate different modules in the brain as if they're totally separate. A lot of people actually appreciate that they interact, and some of the interesting questions are, how do they interact? And we think that a failure to sort of disentangle these different components in design of tasks, and this applies equally for animal experiments as it does for humans or psychiatric patients, can essentially lead to misleading results about the underlying mechanism. I talked about the learning from positive and negative prediction errors as if that was the main thing that was guiding performance. But one of the things that sort of frustrated me in our initial work back in 2004 is that the models that were able to sort of predict asymmetries in positive and negative learning, they were able to predict it in the long run, like how well people are able to choose the most rewarding ones after they've done a lot of learning already, and how much they're able to avoid the most rewarding ones after they've learned that. But they were not very good. The parameters that fit that behavior were not good at describing trial-to-trial changes in behavior from one moment to the next. And that wasn't too surprising to us because we thought the models were good at characterizing this incremental learning process and not other systems that we think are involved, like working memory and hypothesis testing and so forth. And so, in the past 20 years, my colleagues and I and a bunch of other people have studied sort of analogous roles between circuits that link the basal ganglia with premotor cortex, which is sort of what I was alluding to before, learning from positive and negative prediction errors on how to act. But there are analogous circuits that link parts of the basal ganglia with prefrontal cortex, for example, holding in mind information in working memory, if-then scenarios, rule-based processing. That system is thought to be more involved in what's called model-based reinforcement learning, as Sam Gershwin has studied a lot. And then there's ventral striatal circuits that interact with more affective regions of the prefrontal cortex. And all of these areas are innervated by dopamine prediction errors and other things that dopamine might be computing to mediate reinforcement learning. And they also interact with, of course, various other parts of the brain. And these circuits are also not totally segregated from each other. They interact with each other. So that your prefrontal circuit with the basal ganglia also influences how your motor systems act. And so the question is, how do you sort of get at that in one paradigm? Of course, you can't get at everything in one paradigm. But I'm going to try to pick apart one mechanism that, and this work is all in collaboration with Ann Collins, who was a postdoc in my lab, but now is a professor at UC Berkeley. And she developed a new task and model, and I'll try to present to you some evidence that there are separable but interactive neural signals related to essentially the more cognitive working memory process and the more incremental reinforcement learning process. And they interact in, I think, interesting ways. And I'll present some data largely from model-based EEG analyses that tries to extract these different neural signatures and then apply them to schizophrenia. And I'll just say a tiny bit about fMRI. Okay, so to sort of introduce these two components for learning, there's, of course, many more than two components, but I'm going to highlight two of them and argue that they're sort of optimized for different trade-offs. So on the one hand, we have information that we could hold in mind online in a working memory system fashion, and that's fast. You can immediately update working memory, and you could use it to affect behavior within seconds. But on the other hand, there's this sort of instrumental reinforcement learning system that is thought to learn values sort of incrementally and probabilistically. And that's not a bad thing. It's just, it might be slow, but you need to learn incrementally to learn statistics of what's true on average instead of what was true just most recently. And this system is thought to be more flexible. It can be updated more quickly, and this is less flexible. This one, though, has some costs to it. There are some resources or capacity limitations to working memory. We all know that we can't hold in mind that many things at the same time. And that's another line of work that various people are studying, including our lab. What are the nature of those capacity limits? But this instrumental learning system is thought to have much broader capacity. You can learn many more things if you're learning motor skills. You're not limited to just learning a couple of different actions at a time. And not only is this system limited by capacity, it's also limited by decay. So like how recently have you been holding information in mind? You might forget it suddenly. You can have like an attractor dynamic that just collapses. Whereas a mechanism that depends on something like synaptic plasticity is much more robust over the long term. I'm going to skip that part. Okay, so I'm going to now introduce a task that I'm going to show various variants of for the rest of the talk. The task itself is actually quite simple, but you'll see the logic of the manipulation, hopefully. So subjects, these are human subjects, just see a single symbol at a time, in this case a pumpkin. And we tell them they just have to press one of 3 buttons. And they just have to, they don't know in advance which button to press, but one of them is going to be rewarded and the other ones are not. So they just have to learn that. And then they'll get feedback that tells them if they're correct or not, and then they'll see another symbol. That's the core essence of the main part of the task. It seems almost too simple, but you'll see there's a few manipulations. One manipulation is that we control the number of different items they have to learn about concurrently in a block of trials. So in this block of trials, they have 2 items to learn. They see both of the items at the beginning of the block. They're told there's, and that's what we call the set size, NS, is 2. There's 2 stimuli that they have to learn. But in other blocks of trials, there may be 3, 4, 5, or 6 items in the set. So this is an example of a set size of 6. They've shown all the items, but in any one trial, they're still seeing one stimulus at a time. And I guess I forgot to say that the rewarded button is totally independent across stimuli, so it might be the same button, it might not be the same button, and so forth. So the first thing to see is that by this manipulation, we can look at a few different things. So one, we can just look at what's the effect of the reward history, which is how many times have you been correct in the past, and incrementally, if you're learning in according to a slow synaptic mechanism, as that accumulates, you should be better and better at remembering the correct response. Whereas the set size manipulation allows us to test the effects of working memory load. So how many items can you hold in mind? You might imagine that if you're doing this task, you could just say, hey, I remember I pressed button 3 for the pumpkin, and I'm going to just do that again, right? But you might not be able to do that easily for 6 different things that are going back and forth. And you could also test the effect of decay. How long has it been since you saw the stimulus, which is going to vary randomly and be greater for the higher set sizes. There's one other tweak to the task that we added in the most recent version, so I'm just going to show you that now, which is a little bit more analogous to some of our earlier work, where after they've learned, let's say, 12 different blocks of trials of different set sizes and different stimuli, we'll suddenly give them a surprise test phase where everything goes all black. Not sure what happened there. Oh, I do have to say one thing first, is that in the more recent version, there's always one correct button. But the thing that varies is the probability that they're going to get a large number of points, well, just 2 points or 1 point. So if there's 3 buttons, one of them is always wrong, or 2 of them are always wrong, but one of them is going to be correct. But we vary across stimuli the probability that they're going to get a high number of points or a low number of points. So for some stimuli, they have a 25% chance of getting 2 points and 75% chance of getting 1 point. And for some stimuli, it's 50, and for some, it's 75. There's nothing they can do, really, to maximize those points. All they can do is learn what is the correct item. But what we want to know is whether people are still sort of sensitive to these reinforcement statistics, the reward statistics. And that's what we're going to be able to test in this surprise test phase. In the test phase, we just asked them, OK, choose between 2 items at a time. Which one did you think you did better at, or which one did you think was rewarded more? They didn't really know that they had to learn that initially. All they had to learn was which button to press. But if their reinforcement learning system is sensitive to how many points they're getting, which is, by the way, converted into the amount of money that they could win, then they should be better at choosing, let's say, the mountain that might have been rewarded more than the pumpkin. And these don't have to be from the same block of trials. There's actually going to be like hundreds of these stimuli. And so if they've learned something, the idea is that it's not in working memory anymore. It was over the course of many blocks of trials. But whatever they learned in the reinforcement learning system might still be robust to all those different blocks of trials. And so we could ask, how good are they at that? So I'm going to come back to results on that part of it in the second part of the talk. But first, let's go to the basics of how do people actually learn this task. And so in order to do that, I'm going to introduce the most vanilla basic reinforcement learning model that many people apply to fitting reinforcement learning tasks. And this is a version of what's called Q-learning, which is just that for each action that you're considering, if you're choosing between 3 different actions, you have to learn the quality of that action, or with the reward value of that action for a particular state. So for one state, that might be the pumpkin, and you're saying, I want to learn the value of pressing the second button. And the basic reinforcement learning model is essentially just saying that whatever your old estimate was, you update it by according to the reward prediction error. So the difference between the reward you got and your previous estimate is the reward prediction error. So if it's positive, that means things were better than expected. If it's negative, it's less than expected. And then there's one parameter in the learning part, which is this alpha parameter, which is the learning rate. That's just how much do you update your value as a function of each experience. And that's thought to relate to corticostriatal synaptic plasticity, how quickly you can mobilize receptors and stuff like that. And this model is often fit to reinforcement learning data in humans and animals, and people will get these parameters out that describe individual differences in learning, and they will interpret that as if it reflects this incremental reinforcement learning system that is affected by the striatum. But this model makes a very basic prediction, or assumption actually, which is just that each option value, so the value for each action and each stimuli, is updated proportional to the prediction error and the learning rate, and then it's simply stored until it's needed again. But that seems like it's simple enough. But let's see what the predictions are from this model on the tasks that I illustrated. So if you run the model in generative way, so you have it simulate data from the task, and you just plot how likely is it to select the correct button out of the 3 buttons as a function of its experiences. Of course, it starts off at chance, which is about 33%. There's 3 buttons, and then it learns. It's a reinforcement learning model. No big deal, right? But the thing is that what I'm plotting on top of each other here is the predictions of this model as a function of the number of items in the set, right? So there's 2 items, 3 items, 4 items, 5 items, 6 items. It makes no differences in predictions. And I'd say that you don't really need an advanced PhD in cognitive psychology to predict that people might not look like that. You could imagine that if you're learning something with 6 items at a time, it might be harder than if you're learning with 2 items at a time. And in fact, this is from the first study that Anne did. There's big differences. So if you have 2 items to learn, you're nearly optimal, which means you should only need 3 trials to figure out which of the 3 buttons is correct, and then you just stick with that. And so that's essentially what humans do. But then when there's 3 stimuli in the set, 4, 5, and 6, people get slower and slower. And so that doesn't really fit really what this pattern looks like. But as just an aside, if you fit a model to the data, and all you do is fit the regular reinforcement learning model to this data, and you don't look at how that model actually predicts behavior, you might get parameters out, like learning rates, and you might conclude that the model fit is okay, because on average it predicts behavior is going to go up. But you would miss the fact that it's not getting these very big differences in behavior. And so that suggests that the effect of set size on learning is not accounted for by this very basic vanilla reinforcement learning model. Question? Yeah.
But even for n equals 2, the model is not good. So there's no step.
Oh, okay. But this is, I'm just picking one learning rate here. I could have increased the learning rate to be faster, and it would look like all of them are n equals 2. So that we don't know what the... Yeah, that's the next part is saying maybe I've just cheated, or not cheated, but I've just made a straw man here. It's the most basic model you can think of, right? So maybe there are just different learning rates. Not sure why that is happening. So you could say, well, what if I just fit different learning rates to each of the set sizes? And in fact, I'm not showing that, but if you did that, it would look roughly like this. It's not perfect, but it looks pretty good. But there's a few problems with that. So one is that it seems a little bit not so parsimonious. How would the brain sort of decide to use a different learning rate for each set size? It doesn't really make sense, at least normatively, to do that. And if you're going to interpret that learning rate in terms of synaptic plasticity in the striatum, it's not really clear why that would differ. And in fact, when you fit these data and you allow for the learning rates to differ, you get massively different learning rates, right? So for set size 2, you get a learning rate that's almost as high as 1, because people are learning, it's a deterministic task, and they're learning well. But if you fit it to set size 6, it's almost about 0.1. And one of the important points here is that when people, including my lab, does a reinforcement learning experiment, typically you use one set size, which might be 3 or 4. And you'll get a value out, and you'll interpret it as being relevant for the reinforcement learning system. But this is basically showing that you're running multiple experiments in the same subject, and you're getting very different values out. And that means that something different is going on. And it turns out that even if we allow for these different learning rates, while you would be able to capture this average learning curve on average, you won't actually be able to capture some more detailed trial-to-trial dynamics that I'll try to talk about in a second. So one of those is if you look at the delay effects. So now what I'm plotting is how many trials has it been since you were last correct. So let's say you saw the pumpkin, you got a correct feedback for pressing button 3. If it was the next trial, you get the pumpkin again. Not surprisingly, people are pretty good. They're almost perfect at selecting button 3 again. But if it's been 7 trials since you've seen the pumpkin, then they're less good, right? So they go down parametrically with the delay. The question there?
Yeah, have you tried to separate, disambiguate the amount of time since the previous, since last correct versus the number of
No, that's a good question because in our design they're mostly confounded, although of course there's differences in reaction time and we probably could look at that, but they'd probably be too collinear. So, but it's a good question. But we do see these parametric effects that decline with delay, and that's important because if you look at it early in learning, that's when you see these effects, during early parts of the learning curve. But if you look, sorry about this, if you look late in learning, those delay effects go away completely. That is one indication to us that people are probably using something like working memory early in learning, which is capacity limited and also is subject to decay effects and forgetting. But later in learning, they might actually be relying more on a reinforcement learning system that doesn't have that limitation. It may be slower to acquire things, but it doesn't have that limitation. And this effect of delay on learning, and especially how it transitions from early to late, cannot be explained by a basic reinforcement learning model, even one that has some forgetting in it. So that led Anne and I to propose a model that is sort of a hybrid model that has some model of working memory, some model of value-based reinforcement learning that then together produce behavior. So just to give you a sketch of the working memory side of things, there's a large literature on capacity limits in working memory, which are either item-based or resource-based. I'm not going to make a distinction between those for those of you who are interested in that dichotomy. But as a first pass, you can just think of it as if there are 6 items in the set and you have a capacity of 3, then maybe you could only remember 3 at any one time. So maybe you remember the right button or the wrong button for each of these 3 stimuli, but you don't remember it for these other ones in terms of what's being held in your working memory at any one time. And so we could say, well, what's the probability that you have something in working memory for somebody who would have a capacity of 3? As you increase the set size from 1 to 3, everything is flat. But then as the set size goes up to 6, then there's only like a 50% chance that you have any individual stimulus in working memory. So you still may be using working memory here, but you couldn't use it for all of the stimuli at the same time. The policies, or the decision-making system based on working memory, has perfect information from the last trial. So it has a learning rate of 1, essentially. It's just like remembering what happened in working memory. But then we have a decay parameter that estimates how long, in terms of trials, it sort of exponentially decays. And then we could estimate the probability that a stimulus is in working memory with a function that just looks at the ratio of the individual subject's capacity, K, which is something that we're going to estimate from the data, compared to the set size. So if their capacity is less than the set size, then there's going to be some probability that they have the item in working memory. But if they're within their capacity, then they'll have the information in working memory. But we also have another parameter that is just the prior of how likely people are to use working memory in the first place, and how reliable do they think their working memory system is, which is, for this talk, mostly a detail. OK, so we can look at an RL module that has a learning rate alpha that's now applied across all set sizes in this task. So it's just a single learning rate. But now we could also estimate a working memory system, estimate how many items do people hold in mind based on this parameter, capacity parameter K. And then we have a mixture policy that basically says the degree to which we're going to predict behavior comes from this system or that system is itself weighted and inferred over time. So you imagine that initially it makes sense to use working memory because it's going to be the only system that has any information at all. But it does have some capacity limit. So as the reinforcement learning starts to predict the correct behavior, you might want to weight that more strongly. And if you are interested in the details of the equation, it's just simply this. You have a mixture parameter for predicting action between reinforcement learning and working memory. And then you update the weight that scales working memory versus reinforcement learning, just using a simple Bayesian rule of which one is better at predicting the reward. Okay, so all that to say is that on average, then you can actually capture the behavior quite well. So this is the model with just a single learning rate in the RL system and the working memory parameters, and it's predicting these learning curves pretty well. And without, I don't have a lot of time, so I'm not going to go into the details, but this says on the bottom is that it also captures all these other effects like the delay effects and other interactions. The upshot of it is that this model accounts for both the load and the delay effects, but also the interactions in the sense that the load effect, so that's the effect of set size, goes down as the reinforcement learning system learns. So you can just rely on the reinforcement learning system and not rely on your capacity limits. And the same thing is true about the delay effects. They also go down with time, as I showed before, and that's also a property of this model. Okay, so how does that relate to the brain? So initially, we didn't have any brain data. We only had indirect data from neurogenetics, but I'll get to some brain data in a minute. So we thought, based on a large literature, the prefrontal cortex is thought to be involved in working memory, of course, through interactions with basal ganglia and hippocampus and so forth. And the striatal dopamine system is thought to be involved in this sort of RL process. And so can we look at individual differences in the corresponding parameters like the learning rate alpha and the capacity K? So we're going to look for a marker of individual differences, a genetic marker, and then we're of both of these systems. And so the initial study that we did back in 2012, we looked at the COMT gene, which is a gene that codes for catecholaminergic ethyltransferase, which has been linked to breaking down of dopamine in prefrontal cortex, and therefore correlates with the amount of dopamine that people and animals have in prefrontal cortex. But we also looked at this gene that we've been focusing on recently in my lab called GPR6, which is a receptor that's expressed only in the striatum and not the rest of, pretty much not the rest of the brain, and it's actually mostly expressed in the D2 neurons. And we think it's linked to plasticity. And what we found is that when we fit the model to people's behaviors, that this COMP genotype, which is supposed to affect prefrontal function, affects the estimated capacity parameter. So those who have this MET-MET genotype, those are the ones who have been shown in the past to have higher levels of dopamine, have higher capacity, so they're more likely to use working memory in this task. Whereas this GPR6 gene affects the alpha, the reinforcement learning rate. And as an aside here, if we didn't use this RLWM model, which we think is not perfect by any means, but a better characterization of the interaction between systems, if we only used a sort of standard vanilla RL model, we would find that the alpha parameter from that model scales with this COMT gene. This is actually not the case once we estimate it with this model. And this model, well, it looks like there's an effect here. How do you know which one to believe? You just have to trust me that you did the model selection, and this model fits a lot better than that model. But the point is that usually people would just fit one model or a few different models, but if they're not looking at these kind of interactions, you might make the wrong conclusion about what this parameter means. Okay, so then in collaboration with Jim Gold, we looked at schizophrenia patients in this task. And so there's also a long literature on, of course, cognitive function in schizophrenia and also reinforcement learning deficits that relate to negative symptoms of schizophrenia and motivational deficits. A lot of literature would have suggested that there's reinforcement learning impairments. So here's a replication of the basic pattern in healthy controls of the study. And here's what it looks like in patients. And you can see they show the same sort of qualitative patterns, but their overall learning is reduced when you just look at it in terms of average learning curves. When you estimate the model, what you can see is that what this is showing is that the capacity parameter K is significantly reduced in patients. So that's not too surprising. It's been known for a long time that schizophrenia is related to impairments in working memory function. But what this study was showing is that that alone was sufficient to account for all the deficits in learning, because when you look at the learning rate parameters from the RL model and the other RL parameters, there actually was no difference between patients and controls. So that's sort of one sort of suggestive input is suggestive result is that sort of changes in motivational function in schizophrenia in these kind of tasks might be driven more by these sort of top-down processes and not by the dysfunction in the basic RL system itself. But I'll come back to that in, I think, a more compelling way once I get to the next set of studies. So then we wanted to look at can we actually look in neural measures of these processes? And to do that, we're going to use EEG, which is, of course, very coarse for measuring brain activity, but it is pretty good at time resolutions, and we're interested in that. And for the sake of this study, even though some of our other work we're interested in like the sources of particular EEG oscillations and so forth, for this study we're really just trying to test a cognitive model and look for neural correlates without trying to make any claims at all about the underlying sources. And so we're going to apply a decoding approach. We're going to look at individual subjects' voltage at each electrode over their scalp and each time point. And we're just going to do a big GLM that tries to predict whether there are sort of clusters of electrodes in space and time that covary with parameters or variables from the model, or do they covary with things like set size. And hopefully that'll be clear in a minute. So what we'll do is we'll get a spatial temporal mask. So it's essentially looking at, if you look across subjects, are there electrodes that are close to each other in space on the scalp and close to each other in time that once you do permutation testing are significantly correlated with things like Q values from the model, that's sort of expected reward values of actions, or reward prediction errors, the degree to which people are surprised by the outcome. But you can also do the same thing for working memory kinds of things, which I might get to later. And so this is just to show that there are, in fact, in these data, separable clusters of electrodes. I don't expect you to be able to interpret what these mean. I can barely see them myself, but these are the different electrode names. And this is the activity, or this is time from stimulus onset, and the colors are the significant clusters. So that these are the T values of electrodes that you can see. These ones are near each other. This is the region of time, and those are the electrodes that correlate with, in this case, set size. So that's sort of interesting because while we're doing this decoding, the subject is just looking at a single stimulus like a pumpkin. But we're able to decode whether, just based on their brain activity, whether they're in a block of set size 5, 6, 3, 2, 1, and so forth, even though the actual stimulus is the same in each of those cases. And you can decode that after about 300 milliseconds for a couple hundred milliseconds. And we want to ask questions like the degree to which it looks like your working memory is overloaded. Is that related to your behavior and related to predictions from this model? But I'm actually, for now, going to focus on just the RL side of things. So here's a cluster of electrodes that correlates with Q values, which happens a little bit earlier in time. And it's a somewhat different cluster than this one. And again, it's just the T value of the electrodes that are correlated with these model variables. And we could extract any one of these electrodes and just plot its activity corrected for all the other factors in the GLM. And so this is an activity of one of the electrodes that correlates with reward prediction errors, which is actually not showing it here because these are the stimulus onset ones. This was a feedback onset. But this is just showing that you see sort of like a classic ERP-like thing if you sort it by sort of high prediction errors and low prediction errors, and there's sort of a continuum there. I don't have time to go over this, so I'm just going to skip it. So one of the things that's interesting is that you could then, once you've done that, you could try to identify a neural learning curve. So instead of looking at the learning curves of the behavior, you can ask, how do the learning curves of these sort of clusters of electrodes that correlate with model variables change with time? And so this is for the Q value effect. So remember, that's expected reward value, which should go up with time as you learn the task. And what I'm plotting here is just the overlap, which is literally, it's like the dot product of the EEG activity on individual trials, averaged in this case for the first trial after you got a reward, the second trial after you got a reward, and so forth. Looking at the overlap of that with the overall mask that correlates with Q values. And so you can see it goes up, which is what's expected by a Q learning model. But you shouldn't be too excited about that because it's sort of true by definition, right? We looked for neural signals that correlate with Q values. Q values go up with time. And so therefore, when you plot it, it should go up with time, although there's nothing that would make sure that that has to be monotonic, which it pretty much is. And then you could do the same thing at the feedback, and you look for neural signals that correlate with how surprised people are that they got it correct. So that's reward prediction error. This is time after feedback onset. This is the cluster. And And here you could see that people are most surprised, according to this decoding, that they got a reward after the first time they were correct. And then it sort of goes down in a way that is what would be expected from a very basic reinforcement learning model. In this case, the reward is 1 in each of these cases. The only thing that's differing is the expectation. And as you expect reward more, your prediction error signals are lower. Okay, so then we could use that basic approach to study both within trial dynamics and across trial dynamics and look at it in schizophrenia, and then I'll close. So if you look within a trial, we can now say, okay, here's the mask, the EEG mask related to Q values. This is a particular snapshot in time. This is the activity from one of the electrodes. This is just a schematic, or this is the actual activity, but what we really are interested in is the whole mask, not just one electrode. But this is just showing that there is parametric variation in voltage as a function of Q values in this electrode. So when the Q value is high, you see more of a negativity than when the Q value is not high. But now we could ask, how does that vary on a single trial level? So instead of saying, on average, the Q value should be high or low, we want to know, does it look like from their brain activity that their Q value is higher than you would have predicted it from behavior alone, or lower? So it's essentially looking at the residuals. And then we could ask, how does that variation relate to the variation in the subsequent activity during the reward? And so what that's going to, so this is the feedback prediction error activity. What that's going to do is going to allow us to test this basic assumption that is underlying all reinforcement learning models that are based on prediction errors, which is simply that reward prediction error is equal to R minus Q. And usually we get Q by fitting models to behavior, estimating what the Q value is. But we only have an estimate of what their true Q value is because it's just fit to all of the behavior. And the question is, can we get a better estimate by reading off their brain activity in individual trials? So that's what we're going to do, is just use R minus SQ, which is the variable that we get of how much does their brain activity say that they have a high Q value. So if we could read out their Q value from their brain activity, we should predict that when they have high expected Q value, higher than average, then they should subsequently be less surprised when they're actually correct. So if this is really a prediction error and this is really a Q value, there should be a negative correlation between them. And similarly, if you have a low expected value, then you should be more surprised when you're actually correct. So that's the within trial analysis. And essentially, the main result there is that that was true. So you see this sort of negative correlation coefficient. The more you have high Q values at the stimulus onset, the lower you have a prediction error response. But then we start to see some evidence of an interaction where if you plot that coefficient, this is on average, but you can now plot it for each of the set sizes. And one thing you could see is that that coefficient actually gets more and more negative as the set size goes higher and higher and higher. What that means, we think, is that these systems, a standard model that would predict there's a reinforcement learning system and a working memory system operating independent of each other and just competing for decisions, would not predict that, because the reinforcement learning system should just be equally surprised for all set sizes. But the fact that you actually see more of a negative relationship as the set size goes up suggests that there might be something about reinforcement learning and working memory interacting with each other. So let me look at that a little bit more directly. So one interaction you can look at is simply, let's look at the reward prediction error itself, regress it against brain activity with either fMRI or EEG, and plot that as a function of set size. And what you can see is in the striatum and also the frontal parietal network, the degree to which the brain is reflecting the prediction error actually goes up as the set size goes up. So as you're more and more loaded when working memory, it seems like your prediction errors are higher. And that's even more evident if you just look at it in EEG activity in this electrode here. So that started to sort of remind us of some of other work from us and others, looking at how sort of interactions between the prefrontal cortex and the basal ganglia don't necessarily need to be only competitive in terms of controlling behavior, but you could also have some cooperative effects, right? So you could have it such that if something is in your working memory, you just override what the basal ganglia would want to do and directly affect motor cortex. That's one possibility. and there are mechanisms that would allow that to happen. But it's also possible that the prefrontal cortex that has some information in working memory might actually bias the expectations and the learning that goes on down here. And there's various reasons to think that that might be true, and that I think is also fits with a lot of the sort of model-based and model-free learning literature that some of you are familiar with. So if you just look at these neural learning curves again, this is what I was plotting on average, but in fact, I was only plotting that for one set size. And sort of noticed that depending on whether we think there's cooperation or competition, it makes very actually different predictions for how these neural learning curves evolve. So let me try to explain that. So there's a competition model which would suggest that if you have information in working memory, it just suppresses learning in the RL system. So if you're doing something with working memory, you just don't learn in the RL system. And it turns out that that could have explained the scaling of prediction errors with set size. But it predicts that if you're in a low load condition, so this is in blue here, that the prediction errors should decline less steeply, right? Because if something's in your working memory, you're suppressing learning in the RL system. The RL system is just then continues to have its prediction errors. Whereas if you model things in a cooperative way, so the cooperation here is saying that working memory is providing expectations that then informs what reinforcement learning is doing. So the actual prediction error is now not just from the RL Q value, it's from working memory and the RL Q value system. And that model, if you run its predictions for how the prediction error should evolve over time, has exactly the opposite pattern. So it declines more steeply in the low load condition and less steeply in the high load condition. So just to give you an intuition for that, when information is in working memory, if it's providing part of the expectation, then you shouldn't have a prediction error, and therefore the prediction error should decline more steeply for the low load situation. So we think that, okay, so let's look at what the actual data look like. And it looks a lot more like the cooperation model than the competition model. So this is high set size, medium, and low. And you can see it declines clearly more steeply for the low load condition than the high load condition. And so we think that is a signature of cooperation. I hope that was somewhat clear. It's hard to explain this thing quickly. It turns out that the two models that both have these interactions also predict differences in Q values, but they may predict it in the same direction, and we see it in the same direction. So it's sort of a sanity check, and I'm not going to say anything more about that. And finally, I just want to end with going back to schizophrenia data. Oh, and one more thing on behavior, where this is the same, sorry that it's in different colors, but this is the same interaction. So we're sort of in blue, we're showing the same cooperative interaction, that it declines more in low load. Prediction errors decline more in low load than in high load. But that interaction is much reduced in schizophrenia. And we thought that was interesting because the neural markers of working memory itself were actually not altered as far as we can tell, which is not what we predicted. We thought working memory measures would be changed in schizophrenia, but what we're seeing here is a lack of integration between what's going on, we think, in the cortex and what might be going on in the striatum, which fits with another literature on schizophrenia. And that cooperative interaction also is related to negative symptoms in the patients. Okay, sorry. The very last thing I want to say is what I sort of led up to at the beginning, is that there might be some behavioral implications of this. So remember we had that surprise test phase where you had to choose between two items and ask which one was more rewarded. That was what this looks like. The upshot is that healthy people do learn the reward statistics. So as the differences in the reward statistics goes up, this is like one item that had 1.9 expected value versus 1.1, and this is where they're more similar, people are more likely to be correct. So they are somehow more sensitive to the statistics of reinforcement history, even though they didn't have to learn it. And in schizophrenia, that in fact is not impaired at all. In fact, it's numerically a little bit better. So that's again supporting the idea that the basic reinforcement learning system that's integrating these prediction errors is actually not impaired in schizophrenia, despite the fact that the learning phase performance, this is just replicating the earlier study, is dramatically impaired in patients. So patients are bad at learning in this task, but it's because we think, and the models would suggest, of working memory impairments and not this sort of integrative reinforcement learning system. And sort of the intriguing result that's motivated by this interaction between working memory and reinforcement learning is if you fed a regression model and you ask how sensitive are people in their choices in that test phase to the difference in Q values, so how good are they at resolving differences between learned values. So it's positive, that just means they're sensitive to the differences in learned values. But there's also an interaction with set size in a way that's against what my intuition was anyway. So most people might think that if you're learning a task in a harder condition when set size is higher, you're not going to be as good at learning the differences in reinforcement value. But what this data is showing, and also this is a different way of plotting it here, is that people actually learn reinforcement learning values better when their working memory is overloaded. And that's exactly what is actually predicted by this cooperative interaction, because if something's in your working memory, it's giving you the expectation your reinforcement learning system isn't learning as much from it, and you therefore actually learn less in your underlying procedural reinforcement learning system if you're solving things in working memory. And replicated that in another case, but I'm really over time here, so I am going to just go right to the conclusion, which is learning is a mixture of cognitive processes. We think they correspond to distinct but interacting neural networks, and we think that this is just one step forward in a particular kind of behavior, and a particular kind of reinforcement learning, that trying to disentangle them both with the model and with the task design allows us to sort of better target individual differences and dysfunction. And maybe somewhat surprising result that I just went through really quickly at the end is that what we think is the mechanism for skill learning, so reinforcement learning is like eventually you learn how to do sports and play music and so forth. Eventually you do that without thinking too hard. It actually is more robust if your working memory is overloaded. And that might be, maybe that's a take-home message, I don't know. I've always thought that when I'm learning a new sport, I don't want my instructor to tell me all these different things at once. I want to focus on one or two things so that I could really do that, and don't tell me all this other stuff. But this would tell me that maybe I'm wrong, because you actually learn things more robustly if you're totally overloaded. So maybe you should distract yourself. All right, so thanks. Most of that work was done by Ann Collins, my longtime collaborator, and these guys at Maryland for the schizophrenia work and my lab, so thank you. Sorry for going over time. Yeah.
So am I correct to interpret the results that the prediction would be that in schizophrenia there is no, you looked at evidence of a deficit in working memory capacity?
That there's no deficit in working memory?
The interaction, but not in the capacity.
Yeah, so interestingly, when we just fit the model to the behavior, we do see a reduction in capacity, as opposed to reinforcement learning. But when you look at the EEG signals, it turns out that it's really hard to distinguish between, for example, the cooperative model and the competitive model based on just behavior alone. And I guess it's also hard to distinguish between a model in which working memory is itself degraded versus it's just not used to inform learning. And so our most recent results would suggest that, yes, it's actually the interaction that is impaired, and our results for reduced capacity is could be an artifact of that. But I don't want to say that too strongly, because there's a huge literature on more sort of cold cognition working memory with capacity limits that aren't related to reinforcement learning. It's just. Any other questions?
I have a question. So,
Yeah.
In terms of your prediction error signals in MRI, people often see signals in the ventral striatum, but your study of Parkinson's disease mainly speaks to the dorsal striatum. What do you think about the difference between ventral versus dorsal striatum?
Well,
This could be too broad.
no, I'm very interested in differences between ventral and dorsal striatum. Well, I think Parkinson's disease also affects ventral striatum. I mean, some of the hypotheses are that when patients are medicated, the ventral striatum is relatively preserved early in the disease, and the medication acts like an overdose. And for us, the overdose is like if you elevate dopamine levels, you prevent the negative prediction errors from having effects. And I think that in terms of learning about things like state values or values of an overall task rather than like a specific parameters of how you act for specific stimuli. I think the ventral striatum might be involved in that, and that value learning can be biased in Parkinson's disease if the ventral striatum is overdosed, for example. But then more generally, I think of the ventral striatum as, like many people, including yourself, interacting with sort of controlling the dopamine system and receiving input from the dopamine system, and then representing the value of the state that then can be used to train, use the prediction errors that it generates can be used also to train what's going on in dorsal striatum and its interactions with cortex in sort of a hierarchical way. And that kind of thing is hard to study, of course, in just like a behavioral Parkinson's study. You need to do animal experiments like you do. Or we've done a little bit of fMRI studies that have tried to look at different subregions of the striatum that respond to prediction errors in somewhat different ways. Hmm. Yeah, so I was sort of, in some ways I'm shooting myself in the foot because the earlier work that I did had one load and I fit models and made conclusions about its parameters, and now showing that it matters. So, but I think you can get some of the way there with a standard test because of the variation in delay, right? So when you have random presentation of when stimuli happen, you can estimate the effect of decay in a basic RL system, but just assume that that's probably happening within the working memory system. It's just, and I think this is, it's not that we have the ultimate model or task here either. It's just like one step, right? But I think the one, even though as much as I like modeling, I think models should be used to constrain theory and develop better experiments, and not overused to take experiments that weren't designed to test them, right? So we can't really model out all of the working memory stuff in an experiment that wasn't designed to extract that. And the same thing is true more generally for, like, if you wanted to look at the effect of uncertainty on learning, which is something that lots of people are interested in, you have to have a task that manipulates that in some way. So.
I was wondering how you think that it could be incorporated in the relationship between working memory and reinforcement learning.
Yeah, it's a good question as well, because it's always an issue with the collaborations that I've had, or anytime you study cognition in schizophrenia, it's almost always in medicated patients. And so it's hard to know whether any effect that you see is due to the medication, the antipsychotics, or due to the disorder. So, and also, you can do first episode studies in unmedicated patients, but those are also very difficult, and patients are stressed and so forth. So it's often what people do is they look at the haloperidol equivalent dose of how much medication people are taking and see whether that is a predictive factor in any change in performance. And usually it's not, but to be honest, I don't think it's a great measure. So when we look at like effort-based decision making, for example, you see negative symptoms in schizophrenia are related to a reduced willingness to engage in effort in order to get reward. And if you look at that in terms of haloperidol equivalent dose, there's no effect. But if you then instead look at it in terms of whether they're on a drug that has a strong affinity for the D2 receptor, motivated by a lot of rodent research that shows the D2 receptor is really important for effort-based decision making. Now you actually do see in negative symptom patients that the ones that have stronger D2 drugs are the ones that actually look like they have more negative symptoms. And so there's essentially, or that they're less willing to engage in effort. So it's difficult. In these studies, we didn't see an effect except, I kept saying how the reinforcement learning system is intact, medicated patients. And it turns out that if you look at the very highest dose patients, those patients have reduced reinforcement learning rates. And it could be that the medication is sort of mostly normalizing the striatal processing, because it's known that when they're not medicated, they have too high dopamine levels. And so antipsychotics are kind of treating that, but they're not treating the cortical part. And that's fairly well accepted, I think. So it could be that my conclusion of reinforcement learning being relatively intact in the incremental way is actually partly because they're treated with antipsychotics. We don't know that yet.
This time's mic, okay?
Yeah.